So, hello there, and welcome back to another Night of the Movies podcast. I'm Spy Knight, and in these podcasts, I like talking all things music and TV, and whatever I want, whenever I want. And in today's podcast, I am discussing my thoughts on the Beatles Anthology docuseries, and I'm also talking about what my favourite Beatles album is. And I'd be surprised if you hadn't guessed it already. I'd be surprised if you hadn't guessed what my favourite Beatles album is by the thumbnail to this video today. But that's what I'm discussing. I am discussing the Beatles Anthology and what my favourite Beatles album is. So, let's get into it, shall we? The Beatles Anthology. So, the reason I'm talking about the Beatles Anthology docuseries in this podcast today is because I've been watching it over the past couple of weeks, and watching the docuseries has got me back into the Beatles nearly as much as I was when I was much younger than I am now, because I've been a Beatles fan for as long as I can remember. One of my earliest memories is my dad putting on some Beatles songs for me, and I can't remember what the songs were for the life of me. I really wish I could, but I remember him putting some Beatles songs on for me, and I was just in awe of what I was listening. I was taken over me. I was possessed by it, and I was possessed by their music, and that was one of my earliest memories. And when I was much younger, I was a Beatles bore. I was obsessed by the band. I would go on about them, and I rewatched the Beatles Anthology docuseries back to back. I would remember coming home from school and sticking it on because I was so enthralled by it all, and I was so into it, so into learning about their story and anything new Beatles, anything Beatles merchandise I was trying to get. It was a couple of years ago, about 10 years ago, I don't know how you can see on the video, but I got an Abbey Road post about then. It was about 10, maybe over 10 years ago now, that I actually got that Abbey Road poster for the first time, and I remember going to Liverpool and picking up all this Beatles merchandise. I remember collecting the figures from the Yellow Submarine movie, and I even remember getting the Sgt. Pepper suit at a much younger age. I was obsessed with the Beatles from a very young age, probably much younger than you really think. Genuinely, I've always been a Beatles fan. But it got to a point, I'm not really sure when it was, maybe when I was going into secondary school, but it got to a point where I wanted to step away from the Beatles, because I think I'd become too obsessed, and the music was starting to wear off on me. Not that I was coming to dislike it, not at all. I was still enjoying listening to their music, but I think I'd seen the Beatles Anthology series way too many times. I genuinely mean it. I think I'd seen it like 20 times in a row, and I'd listened to their music to the point that I was kind of becoming tired of it. Again, I wasn't disliking it, but it was the magic of their music was wearing off on me. So I took a step back from their music. I didn't stop listening to their music entirely, but I started to listen to other artists, and that's when I got into people like John Williams, who is my favourite composer working today. Fingers crossed he's still working in the next couple of years, by the way, because there's some reports at the moment, there's some rumours going around that he's actually quite ill, so fingers crossed for John Williams. But anyway, that's another topic for another day. But basically what I was saying before was that that was around the time I was getting into John Williams. That was around the time I started to listen to more Oasis, which obviously were heavily influenced by the Beatles. That was around the same time I started listening to more Elton John, more Blur. You get the point I'm making. I was listening to a lot more music around then. Queen as well. I became a huge Queen fan around the time that I started to take a step back from the Beatles. However, as I've already mentioned, I never stopped listening to the Beatles. They were always in my life, to the point that sometimes I would stick on Beatles songs when I was in a bad mood, and it would just lighten up my day. And I play in a brass band, and I actually played quite a few Beatles pieces. Well, I played this Beatles medley at a brass band that I play at. Every time I played the Beatles medley, it made me want to go back home and listen to the songs. So you get the point I'm making. The Beatles have always been in my life. I may have taken a step back from them for a bit, and I may not have been as big of a Beatles fan as I used to be for quite a bit of time, if you follow me, but I've always been a Beatles fan. And over the past 10 years, I've had these nagging thoughts at the back of my head that I should check out the Beatles Anthology series again, because I have them all on DVD. Well, they weren't originally mine, they were my dad's, but when he passed away, because he passed away a couple of years ago now, he left them to me. Actually, before he passed away, I took them from his room, and I remember one of my fondest memories was him coming into my bedroom, seeing the Beatles Anthology box set, and he was asking, why have you got that in your room? Why don't I have it in my room? But I basically took it from him at a young age, and it sat there on the shelf, on my DVD shelf at the back of my room. Every time I walked past a box set, I thought to myself, one day I need to rewatch that. I need to rewatch the Beatles Anthology series, because I had all these memories of watching it when I was a kid, and they were just coming to fruition every now and then. They were just, those memories would make me go, oh yeah, I need to check that out. They were just, you know, I don't know how to best explain it. They sort of appeared in my memory. That's probably not the best way of explaining it, for lack of a better phrase. They appeared in my memory every now and then when I heard about the Beatles. And as I said before, you know, I just kept having these thoughts. I need to one day check out the Beatles Anthology again. And that's exactly what I did a couple of weeks ago, because yeah, over the past couple of months, I've been getting into the Beatles kind of the same way I was when I was at a young age. I've not become a Beatles obsessive again. At least I don't think I have. Maybe some other people around me may argue otherwise. But I've been getting into the Beatles quite a lot again. And maybe it's because I'm seeing Paul McCartney live this Christmas. Can't wait to see him in Manchester this Christmas. I've seen him on December the 14th. So yeah, maybe it's because of that. Or maybe it's because I realised how exceptional and how amazing their music really is. So, over the past couple of weeks, I sat down and I watched the Beatles Anthology. And having not seen it in what feels like over 10 years, I was completely taken aback when rewatching it now. It was almost like I was watching it for the first time all over again, but at the same time it wasn't. It was like I was watching it for the first time, but it was like it had existed in my life for all of these years. It's like all those memories I had of watching this docuseries when I was at a much younger age were coming back. You know, all those memories were sort of fitting together, because when you have memories, they don't totally link together. But then when I was rewatching the docuseries, I was like, oh my god, I remember having these memories of watching this section of the Beatles Anthology when they're talking about Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band. I remember watching this section of the Beatles Anthology when they're talking about recording the White Album. This section when they're talking about when they stopped touring. This section when they're talking about working on A Hard Day's Night, the album and the film. I was watching sections of this, I was watching all of the Beatles Anthology even over the past couple of weeks and going, I mean, this is so incredibly fascinating, and it's so incredibly entertaining to watch as well, especially as I'm a big Beatles fan, and watching the Beatles story told from the Beatles themselves makes all the difference. Because I've seen a couple of Beatles documentaries here and there where they don't actually interview any of the members of the Beatles or anyone close to the Beatles, like George Martin, who is the long-time producer on most of the Beatles records, or Neil Aspinall, who is a Beatles road manager who ended up, he ended up running the Beatles company Apple Corps. They don't interview people who are close to them, they just interview people who knew them at the time. I've seen some Beatles documentaries which, long story short, don't work that well because they're telling the story but not from the Beatles' perspective. And here is why the Beatles Anthology works so well, because they tell the story from the Beatles' perspective. The series was made in the 90s. I'm not too sure when the series was made. I probably should have looked it up before. One sec. I'll just quickly look it up on Google. When was the Beatles Anthology made? Give me an answer. So apparently it came out in 1995. Although it's saying 2003. But I'm going to say it came out in 1995. Let's say it did. And the great thing about it coming out in 1995 is you were able to get interviews from George Harrison as well before he passed away, before he sadly passed away, and he talks very candidly about his experience in the Beatles. And sure, and these were all interviews made for the docuseries, by the way. These weren't interviews which were done for something else. All the interviews in the series were done for the series itself. And sure, John Lennon was sadly no longer alive by the time they made this docuseries. But they used a lot of archival interviews from Lennon himself, which fit perfectly with the narrative being portrayed in this series. And getting to hear the story from the band themselves and the people who are close to the band makes all the difference. There's a sense of authenticity that comes with it, and also makes it, like I said before, very enjoyable to watch, because seeing Paul McCartney in interviews that were made for this docuseries talk about his time in the Beatles and talk about it in such a eloquent and talk about it in such an eloquent way, far better than I talk about things. Paul McCartney is, my God, he is a good speaker. He can talk for hours. He's one of those people who can talk for hours, and you'd be so hooked into what he was saying, because it's Paul McCartney and he tells stories in such a way that I am drawn to what he is saying. And I don't think it's just because it's Paul McCartney, or maybe it is, but just the way he says things is so it's so enthralling. I get into it so much, and my admiration, for Paul McCartney has increased so much after rewatching the Beatles Anthology. I mean, I always love Paul McCartney, always love him ever since I first heard about the Beatles. But I love him even more now, and I can't wait to see him live this Christmas. Genuinely, I'm so excited. I have a trio of artists I would love to see live. The Golden Trio, I call it. Elton John's on the trio. I saw Elton John live last year, one of my favourite experiences. And Paul McCartney is on that trio. I'm seeing him live this year. John Williams is also on the trio. Don't think I'm going to get to see John Williams live, unfortunately. But Paul McCartney is on that trio. And I just can't wait to see. He's on the Golden Trio, and I can't wait to see him live this year. And also seeing interviews from Ringo Starr that were done for this docuseries is very interesting and very enjoyable, because he's a really funny person. He talks about the Beatles in a candid light, but he also has a bit of comedy to what he's saying, like when he's talking about Sgt. Pepper's. And by the way, just because you get interviews from the band themselves, it doesn't mean they glorify their time of being in the band, because you get this section of the docuseries where they're talking about the Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band album, and Ringo says, "Oh, it's a fine album, but I did learn to play chess on it." And he talked about how he was always waiting on the album. He's always waiting for things to happen, and I love that about it, because he's honest. He doesn't say, "Oh, I loved Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band. It's one of the most influential albums, and I'm so happy that I was the drummer on the album." He doesn't say that. He's honest about it, and I love that about this series. It doesn't glorify their time of being the Beatles. I mean, it's honest, and they talk about all the ups they had, all the advantages, all the fame and fortune they had, all the Beatlemania craze out surrounding them. But it also, like I said before, it doesn't glorify them. You hear the interviews from the band members themselves, and they often have opposing views. Like going back onto the Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band album, Paul McCartney talks a lot in this docuseries about how much he loves the album, how the day the album came out he had this party, and it was a party that lasted over a weekend, and then you cut to George Harrison talking about how he didn't really like the album. He didn't really like Sgt. Pepper's. His heart was more in India by the time they came around to recording the album. And I love all that stuff, because it was from anybody else who was just going, "Oh yes, Sgt. Pepper. Ha ha ha, perfect." That's what I would be doing if I was interviewed for a Beatles documentary or Beatles docuseries like this. But because it's from them, you get such a it's a far more fascinating insight into the story of the Beatles. And I was rewatching this series going, oh, the Beatles have such a fascinating story. A story unlike any other band. And granted, I may not know many band stories. Like, I'm not too familiar on Oasis's story or Queen's story, although I have seen Bohemian Rhapsody, but I don't know how accurate that film is. I'm not too familiar on... Basically, name a band and I'm probably not familiar on their story. But at the same time, I can't imagine any other band having the same kind of story that the Beatles had. They start in the early 60s. Ringo isn't even in the band, it's Pete Best. But then they kick Pete Best out, they bring Ringo in, and the Beatles start selling out gigs at the Cavern in Liverpool, and then they start selling out gigs around the UK, and then they start selling out gigs around the world to become one of, if not the most famous band, the most popular band in the world. And then some things go wrong. John Lennon says he's bigger than Jesus. The band gets tired of touring because it becomes too much and they want to get more experimental. And in order to get more experimental, they needed to stop touring, and that's why they do so. I mean, there's far more to it than that. I oversimplified it there, but the series goes into great detail about why they stopped touring, and then it talks about how innovative the Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club album, I was about to say Balbum, the Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club album was. Then it talks about how when the Beatles were, recording the White Album and Let It Be, they were gradually breaking up over time, over a very long period of time, but they were breaking up, and how those albums affected them and how those tensions in the band when those albums were being recorded. And then it talks about how they came back together to make Abbey Road, and they all kind of knew, because they never definitively say, but they all kind of knew that Abbey Road was going to be their last album. And then the docuseries also talks about how the band were united after John Lennon sadly passed away. How John Lennon had some leftover demo tracks, and they recorded some music to go with those demo tracks, so they're still classed as Beatles songs. They recorded Free as a Bird and Real Love, I think in the late 90s or early 2000s. It was before George Harrison passed away, and George Harrison passed away in 2002. So it was before he passed away, because he still plays on it all, and that's how they're classed as Beatles records. And I love how the story has this bittersweet end to it, and how much of a roller coaster story is as well. Like, they're on a high and then something goes wrong, they're on a high and then something goes wrong. That's kind of how the beginning of the story goes, and how I love how comprehensive the series is. I love how comprehensive this is, as it explores in great detail about the making of those later albums, and how the Beatles were obsessed, with coming up with new sounds, not only in the later albums post Sgt. Pepper's, but also with songs like I Feel Fine, and with the Rubber Soul album, and with the Revolver album, how they were coming up with new sounds, and the significance of the song Yesterday on the band. There's so much detail in the series, which I just found so incredibly fascinating as a Beatles fan, as a huge Beatles fan at that. And I don't even think you need to be a huge Beatles fan, though, in order to enjoy this series. When I rewatched the docuseries over the past couple of weeks, I rewatched all of it with my mom, and I rewatched some of it with my gran. And my gran's never been a big Beatles fan. She liked some of the Beatles songs, but I don't think she's a huge fan of Paul McCartney. She doesn't like Hey Jude, which I always find funny. And she rewatched some of it with me over the past couple of weeks. And again, they're not big Beatles fans. My mum has never been a huge Beatles fan, and neither is my gran. But even they were finding it fascinating. Even, my brother joined it at one point when I was rewatching this series, and he was just as engrossed in it as I was. And that tells you how good the docuseries is. Because, as a Beatles fan, of course, I'm going to enjoy hearing the Beatles story from the Beatles' perspective. But seeing other people who aren't as big Beatles fans as I am enjoyed and being as engrossed in it as I was, then, you know, that tells you how good of a docuseries this really is at explaining and exploring in comprehensive detail as to why the Beatles are so influential, why their story was so fascinating, and why they're still considered one of, if not the best band of all time. You know? They're far better than the Rolling Stones. They don't actually talk about that in the docuseries. They don't talk about the rivalry between the Beatles and the Rolling Stones. But sign on here to anybody who prefers the Rolling Stones. They're not as good. I like some Rolling Stones songs for sure. Really, I do. I'm a big fan of Gimme Shelter. I think that's an amazing piece of music. But the Stones aren't as good. They don't have as many memorable hits, and I think pretty much this little detail I'm about to tell you, this little fact, little piece of trivia I'm about to tell you, pretty much tells you everything you need to know about the Rolling Stones and the Beatles rivalry. The first Rolling Stones hit was a cover of I Saw Her Standing There by the Beatles. That's pretty much all you need to know about the rivalry between the Beatles and the Rolling Stones. But anyway, that was just went a little tangent there about the Beatles versus the Rolling Stones. But annoying when people say they're more of a Stones fan, and I'm like, why? The Stones are good, but they weren't as good. And fully enough, you actually see Mick Jagger in quite a bit of footage, and quite a bit of the old footage of the Beatles that you see in this series, that you see in the docuseries. He appears in quite a bit of footage. So clearly, and I think Paul McCartney said this on numerous occasions, clearly the Beatles and the Rolling Stones got along. I don't know if they felt there's any rivalry there. Maybe they did. Maybe that's why they got along so well. You know, there's that whole saying, keep your friends close but your enemies closer. I don't think they were enemies, by the way. But maybe that's why they got along so well. But it was funny, you know, watching this docuseries and seeing Mick Jagger pop up quite a few times. I'm like, is he trying to spy on them, trying to get their ideas? Because, you know, the Rolling Stones did copy a couple of big things from the Beatles. But anyway, that's another topic for another day. This series, I would love to get another life, and that's why I've titled this podcast today, "The Beatles Anthology Deserves More Love." That's a check that I definitely did title it because I've got it on my notes, but I did. That's definitely what I put in the title of the podcast today. The Beatles Anthology deserves more love because I don't feel enough people have seen it, and maybe, you know, it did get a lot of love when it first came out, but I wasn't around. I wasn't born when the Beatles Anthology docuseries first came out. And I feel like now, if it was put on a streaming service, it would give this docuseries, which deserves so much more attention and so much more love, a second life. You know what I mean? People would actually understand why the Beatles are so influential and why their story is so fascinating, and why they were so important to music as well. Because I cannot tell you how many people I've spoken to who just go, I'm not a big Beatles fan, I don't think they're that good, and I think they're overrated. Every time someone says that the Beatles is overrated, I want to, and I'm not a violent person whatsoever, but I want to throw them in a lake. I just want to push them over. I just want to whack them over the head with a wet fish and just go, I'm sorry, what do you mean? Somebody I used to talk to quite a lot, one of my close friends back in the day, said to me, I've never been a big Beatles fan. And I was like, why? And I was like, I don't get them. And I'm like, what do you not get about them? And I feel like if this series was on a streaming service, people would get their story. You know, and like I said before, I don't think you have to be a big Beatles fan in order to enjoy watching this series. You know, Peter Jackson, who directed the Get Back docuseries, which came out a couple of years ago now, and remastered the Let It Be movie from 1970 early this year, I think he did that. He needs to get on to remastering this series. And I don't think he ever will. I don't think he ever will, because now he's working on a new Lord of the Rings movie with Andy Serkis, because Peter Jackson first made his name. That's where he first really made his name, with the Lord of the Rings trilogy. That's when he became the director, the Academy Award winning director we all know him to be now. But I would love Peter Jackson to come back and do more Beatles stuff and remaster and restore all this footage from the Get Back. Not from the Get Back docuseries, from this docuseries, from the Beatles Anthology docuseries, and put it on like Disney Plus or Prime Video, or maybe an Apple TV Plus actually, because no one watches that. But put it on a streaming service which a lot of people watch. Preferably put it on Disney Plus, because they seem to have all the Beatles stuff at the moment. That's where they put the Get Back docuseries and the Let It Be film when they restored it. So do that with the Beatles Anthology series. I don't understand why no one's done that. I don't understand why neither Paul or Ringo have rung up Peter Jackson and go, "Hi, how about we stole the Anthology series so people can actually know about a story and don't think we're overrated anymore?" You know, I would love that to be the case, because after rewatching the Anthology series, I mean, there's so much stuff that it goes into detail on that I don't see how you can't find fascinating. Like, even the smallest of things it goes into detail on, like when the Beatles met Elvis and how they were good friends with him and they got along with him, and then how Elvis wanted them banned from America after they'd met him. And it's a little piece of information like that where I'm like, how is this not out there? How do more people don't know? How do more people not know about this? You know, because yeah, as I've said before, and I was going to say about a million more times in this podcast today, it's so fascinating. It's fascinating with a capital F. And sure, I have a couple of nitpicks with this anthology series. If someone, was to ask me, I would say I wish the series went into a little more detail on the White Album recording sessions, because from what I understand, tensions were very high there. And I would have liked there to be a bit more detail. They do go into detail on the White Album. They don't just skim over it. But I would have liked there to be a little bit more detail. And I would have liked there to be a little bit more detail on the recording sessions for the Abbey Road album. Because apparently the song Maxwell Silver Hammer, Paul made the entire band work on that song time and time again. Apparently, according to Ringo, they worked on that song for weeks on end, and they were all, apart from Paul, they were all sick of it. They all hated the song Maxwell Silver Hammer, but Paul wanted to work on it so much because he was a perfectionist and he wanted to perfect that song. And I would have liked this docuseries to touch on that more, but that's like, those are my only two, I'm not even big, I was about to say big criticisms. They're my only two things I would have changed in this series, maybe gone into more detail on, because I particularly loved how the Beatles Anthology series explored how innovative the Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club album, I was about to say album again, how the Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club album was. Because if you hadn't guessed already, I'd be very surprised. I have my t-shirt today, and I've got a Sgt. Pepper suit behind me, hanging on my chair. That is my favourite album of all time. I absolutely love the Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band album, and I love it even more after rewatching the Beatles Anthology. It solidified my feelings that it is the best album of all time, because in one single album, it's not a double album like the White Album is. And by the way, I love the White Album, not a knock on it, I'm just saying it's not a double album like the White Album is. On one single album you hear the entire range of the Beatles, from the first song, which is titled the Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band song. You get the classic Beatles rock sound that you had in Revolver and Rubber Soul, mixed with brass band instruments, and it's brilliant. That song I listen to whenever I want to kick, whenever I want to feel some motivation. I listen to the Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band song, and then that goes into With a Little Help from My Friends, which has an intro which is very unique, to say the least, because it connects to the first song on the album, and I think it's Ringo's best song. I don't think Ringo wrote it, but I think that's a song which really showcases how good of a singer Ringo actually was and still is. Then you get, if I remember correctly, the next song on the album is Getting Better, which, I know it's Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds, how could I forget? It's Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds, which embodies the psychedelic sound of that time and how the Beatles were, you know, experimenting with music and at the same time still making catchy music, and also how they were experimenting, well, maybe not experimenting is the right word there, but how they were taking a lot of drugs, because the initials for that song are LSD, and I know each Beatle has come out and said, oh no, Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds wasn't about LSD. I'm pretty sure it was. I think everybody outside of the Beatles agrees that it was about the effect of them taking drugs, and that the sound of Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds is so 60s, psychedelic. It's such a psychedelic sound that I think you can only attribute to the Beatles. Then, if I remember correctly, you get on to Getting Better, which is a great Beatles, sort of rock song that you'd find in one of their earlier albums, but you think it's just a normal Beatles song until you hear the sitar come in at one point. It's like, oh wow, we're infusing different sounds here. And then you go on to She's Leaving Home, which is the first song on the album that, if I remember correctly, George Harrison and Ringo Starr don't play on. Like, you get a string, that song mainly consists of a string quartet and Paul McCartney and John Lennon singing harmonies together, and it's such a unique sound that I think only the Beatles can make work. Then I think you go on to Being for the Benefit of Mr. Kite, which is one of the most peculiar but memorable songs I've ever listened to. It possesses me whenever I listen to it. It keeps me hooked throughout. Like, the sounds you hear in Being for the Benefit of Mr. Kite are unlike any sound I've heard in any other song, period. Then you go on to Within Without You, which is George Harrison's song on the album. And Within You Without You is this perfect infusion of two cultures. And I think only George Harrison could make that song work. I used to not like that song, but the more I listen to it, the more I love it. Because I'm not a big fan of Indian music. It's just not for me. Not a knock on anyone who isn't that music. Just not really my style of music, personally. But I listened to that song, and I like the sitar sound. And I usually don't like sitar sounds in music. So that tells you how well that song is written and put together. And then the album goes on to something completely different with, if I remember correctly, it goes on to When I'm 64, which is a sort of blues record. It's a blues Beatles record. It's very much a Paul McCartney sounding song with a saxophone or a clarinet on the song. You get the point I'm making. It's a bluesy sounding record, and it's so different than the last song, and it's so catchy at the same time. I love When I'm 64. It's such a groovy piece of music. And next, the album goes on to Fix and Go Home, which sounds like your average Beatles song, but not a knock on it whatsoever. But it's also got this unique sound about it. There's something about Fix and Go Home which is so Sgt. Pepper sounding, you know what I mean? And then you get on to Lovely Rita, which is, in my opinion, the perfect liminal piece of music on an album, the perfect transitional piece. If you listen to that song outside of listening to the entire album, I don't think it has the same effect. When you listen to the entire Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band album, that song is in the perfect place. Then you go on to Good Morning, Good Morning, which is one of my favourite songs because it's so strange, but and it shouldn't work, but it works because it's from the Beatles, and it includes all these sounds which you wouldn't usually get on a song. Like at the end of Good Morning, Good Morning, you hear dogs barking. You just hear a bunch of animal sounds at the end of the song Good Morning, Good Morning, which I don't think you really heard in music by that point. I love how they started to use sounds which you hadn't really heard in music by the time they got to this album. Then the song Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band has a reprise, and it's great because it makes the album feel like you've just been watching, or listening, should I say, to a performance from the band. And at the time, they were trying to move away from touring because it kind of got tired of touring. It took its toll on them, and they wanted to put a new face on the band, but at the same time make it feel like you're still watching or listening to a Beatles concert, if you follow me. And that's the genius of the Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band song Reprise, because it makes the album feel like it's all been one continuous performance. And I don't know any other album, and there might be other albums that do this, but I don't know any other album that does that. And I love that. And then the album finishes with A Day in the Life. One of the most hauntingly beautiful songs, if not the most hauntingly beautiful song, or the most hauntingly beautiful piece of music I have ever heard. Genuinely, every single time I listen to that song, I feel possessed. I'm like, oh my god, only the Beatles can make this work. I don't even have words to describe A Day in Life. It's that good. And you can just tell there how much I love this album. And I love the range in this album. How it has brass instruments. How it has a string quartet. How it uses sitars at one point. And how it finishes with A Day in the Life, which has this orgasm of sound where it all builds up to this grand conclusion. And then they hit the piano and it goes boom. If you listen to the album, you know exactly what I'm talking about. If you haven't listened to the album, you probably think I'm going crazy, and maybe I am, but at the same time, you get the point I'm making. I love the album. I love this album so much, and I know what some people, some big Beatles fans who are maybe watching or listening to this podcast today might be saying. Oh yes, all the things you said Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band, the album, does, Revolver did the year before. And sure, I understand what you're saying. In Revolver, you've got Eleanor Rigby, that has a string quartet. In Revolver, you've got Tomorrow Never Knows, which I think uses the sitar in it. In Revolver, you've got brass instruments on the song Yellow Submarine. The only thing that makes Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band, or not the only thing, but one of the things that makes the Sgt. Pepper's album better for me over the Revolver album, is I just prefer the songs. Not to say Revolver has bad songs, not at all. I think I Want to Tell You, Got to Get You Into My Life, Here, There and Everywhere. I can go on and on and on. Taxman are all great songs on the Revolver album, but none of them are quite like the songs in the Sgt. Pepper's album, at least for me. So that is why the Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band album is my favourite album of all time. Easily my favourite Beatles album. That being said, I do love all of their albums though. There isn't a single Beatles album where I go, that one I'm not too big on. Even Beatles for Sale, which is my least favourite Beatles album, I still think has quite a few bangers. I listen to the songs from that album almost daily, you know what I'm saying? And for me, Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band is the best Beatles album, but second best is the Abbey Road album. The only song I don't like on Abbey Road is Because. It's the one song where I'm like, I don't know what they're going for here. Every song in that album, other than Because, I think are great. You know, and I love how that album ends with this big medley, which is insanely good. It's perfect. But unlike Sgt. Pepper's, where I love every single song on that album, I don't love every single song on Abbey Road, but I do think it is a almost perfect album. And then my third favourite Beatles album would be Help. You have to say it with a bit of a oomph. You have to say like, Help, because it has an exclamation mark. Help! Exclamation mark. That's my third favourite Beatles album, because I think that's when the Beatles managed to make every song in that album insanely catchy. I think after Help, they mastered it. They'd made every single song in their album insanely catchy, is what he said. And I think Help is where you first hear that. Every song on Help is so catchy. You know, help, I need somebody, help. I could sing those songs off the top of my head now, just because, they're like ingrained into me, you know what I mean? And watching the Beatles Anthology, linking it back to what I'm meant to be talking about in this podcast today, watching the Beatles Anthology has made me love those albums and the music of the Beatles so much more than I did over the past 10 years, should I say. I was about to say the past couple of years. No, over the past 10 years. Because, my affection for them had worn off. But now, my affection for them has only grown more. You know, I love the Beatles. I love them so much. And the Beatles Anthology has made me love them the way I do. I think it made me love them the way I did when I was a kid. It made me become this obsessive when I was at a much younger age, and it's made me become this obsessive, because I probably am an obsessive again. It's made me become this obsessive all over again. God, it's such an amazing piece of filmmaking. It really is. And I don't think there's anything like it. I know there's other Beatles documentaries out there, like the Ron Howard Beatles documentary, 8 Days a Week, the touring years, 1962 to 1966. I know that's out there, and it includes interviews from the Beatles themselves. But it's not, because it's a film, it's not going to go into the same amount of detail. And I think only the Beatles Anthology does that, you know? And now we have a sort of extension to the Beatles Anthology series, because last year we got the last ever Beatles song release, Now and Then, which I've had on repeat ever since that song was released. I listen to Now and Then daily. That song holds such a special place in my heart. Has a personal meaning to me. You know, I related to my dad, who is sadly no longer with me, and wasn't around to listen to that song, but whenever I listen to that song, I think of him, and I think it also holds a special place for the Beatles discography, because I think John Lennon wrote it about Paul McCartney before he passed away. And I do think that makes the story all that more interesting, because watching the Beatles Anthology, I have come to appreciate John Lennon as a songwriter so much more than I did before. Same with George Harrison, same with Paul McCartney, as I've already said, same with Ringo Starr. I've come to appreciate them as musicians, as world-class musicians, and also as people more, because you really do get an idea about how much these guys loved each other, and how, yeah, sure, they didn't always get along, but, you know, that's family for you. And I think this series does a really great job at, not just a great job anyway, it does a bloody amazing job at exploring that in the way you want, if you are interested in the story of this band, because it is a story unlike none other. And I think this docuseries does justice to the Beatles story, and I want people to see it for that reason. I want people to see this docuseries so they can understand why the Beatles are so flipping important and why they're so flipping influential, instead of just calling them overrated, because they're not overrated. And I think the series does just really terrific job at exploring that. But, you know, it's hard to find. I've had the box set for as long as I can remember, but I didn't buy it, and God knows where my dad got it. So, yeah, I don't know how difficult it is to get, but doing a bit of research online, I found out that it's not easy to find, and so that's why I'm saying it deserves more love, because it may have got love when it came out. Perhaps that was the case, but it needs more love now, you know, and hopefully it'll get that soon enough. Fingers crossed that happens, because it deserves it. And if I was to give a rating to this docuseries, the Beatles Anthology docuseries, I'd easily give it a 10 out of 10. There's not a single thing I would change about it. I had my little nitpicks here and there, but I seem to have a little nitpicks with everything. I'm just going to get over that sometimes. I think there's no better way for their story to be told, you know, at least for me. And rewatching it, it's made me fall in love with the band all over again. And also, when I was rewatching the docuseries, and that's the last thing I'll say because it's been going on for quite a while, rewatching the docuseries, I was thinking, oh, who's going to play them in the biopics? I was like, oh, who's going to play George Martin in the biopic? Because obviously the Beatles, there's four Beatles biopics in the works from Sam Mendes, director of Skyfall, Spectre, Road to Perdition, American Beauty, and so on and so on. He's done many, many fantastic movies in the past. He's doing 4 Beatles biopics, and there's going to be one on Paul McCartney, there's going to be one on George Harrison, one on John Lennon, and one on Ringo Starr. And I was watching the docuseries thinking, oh, who's going to play who? You know, I think that Benedict Cumberbatch is going to play George Martin. Maybe that's the case. Maybe that happens. Maybe it doesn't. I was thinking, oh yeah, I could see House Dickinson as Paul McCartney, because there has been a rumoured cast out there that they've selected for the Beatles biopics, but nothing's been confirmed, which is why I haven't made a video on it. As soon as the cast is officially confirmed for the Beatles biopics, I'll make a video on it, but that's why I haven't yet. Because honestly, I've spoken about this on the channel in the past, the Beatles biopics are my most anticipated movies for the next 5 years. I can't wait for them to come out. They're not coming out until 2027, but like every time I think about them, I get deliriously excited. And we're only in 2024, you know. So yeah, I can't wait to the Beatles biopics. And I was watching this series thinking, oh, who could play Brian Epstein? Who could play Neil Aspinall? Who could play this person? Who could play this? And it was a fun game to play. You know, I did come up with some interesting casting. Like I think Andrew Scott could make a good Brian Epstein. So yeah, I think it's going to be very interesting to see what casting is done for the Beatles biopics, especially because I know the story now, you know. And I think I'm going to rewatch it again, definitely before the biopics come out, and maybe I'll rewatch it a couple more times before the biopics come out. You know, you get the point I'm making. I think you understood the point I'm making a long while back in this podcast. Ages and ages ago on this podcast, I think you got what I was trying to say. I think the Beatles Anthology series deserves more love because it tells the Beatles story in comprehensive, fascinating, and in incredible detail that could only happen from the band members themselves. Hearing their story, hearing the Beatles story, which is unlike any other story of any other band, from the Beatles themselves, makes this docuseries so incredibly enjoyable to watch. And there's 8 parts to the docuseries. I think the first part is like an hour and 20 minutes, and I think after that it starts to each episode after that is about an hour long. And if you can find it, if you can somehow check it out, I highly recommend to do so, because there is nothing quite like it, especially as a big Beatles fan. However, I think even if you're not a big Beatles fan, it's still incredibly fascinating to watch. Yes, the Beatles Anthology is perfection, in my opinion. And so, as I've already said, and as I'm going to say once more in this podcast today, the Beatles Anthology is a 10 out of 10 from me. Anyway guys, that's it for today's podcast. If you have seen the Beatles Anthology, please let me know your thoughts on it in the comment section below. Maybe you agree with me, or maybe you think the Beatles story is told better somewhere else. Whatever your thoughts are on the Beatles Anthology, or on the Beatles in general, please let me know in the comment section below. And as always, thank you for watching or listening to this podcast. And if you haven't yet, please do click down below and like and subscribe on this podcast. I look forward to many more podcasts coming very, very soon on this channel. As I've already said, thank you so much for watching or listening to this podcast. And yeah, somehow we got to the end. I will see you guys again soon. But bye for now. Bye.